Been looking forward to tonight. I say that. I was looking forward to tonight until David cracked some jokes on Sunday, and I've been nervous ever since. And you know what? I was trying to think about, I don't think he's even in here. I was trying to think about some funny quip or something that I could say. But here he comes. But it probably would have been better to say this without him in here, but David, I was just saying, I was excited about this class, and then I heard some jokes on Sunday, and I was trying to think of a comeback, and I've decided you're the most ungettable person, because he's so nice, anything I'd say would make me look bad. So it's like, I just gotta take an L. So David 2, Kellen 0 is where we're at. Yeah. I think Eliane will have some ideas. That's a good point. So to be continued. No, we're going to have fun tonight because we're talking about hard sayings. Doesn't that sound like you're kind of fun? We want to look at the teachings of Jesus. And some of the more challenging teachings, I think, the ones that we can avoid sometimes, can be the ones that have the most to offer. And by no means am I saying, by teaching this class, that I have the answers. If I'll direct you over to David if you have any questions that I can't answer. But yeah, well, I guess we all just need to pray. But I do think it's worthwhile for us as a family, a church family, to wrestle with these things together. And I hope that we can get something out of looking at some things that maybe are confusing on their surface, and oftentimes they're really not too bad whenever you get into it. So last class, we looked at the passages where Jesus talks about hating your family, and he uses that word hate as a bit of a hyperbole, just a demonstration of what the comparison between your relationship to him versus anything else should look like. So that's what that word in that passage kind of meant. And then we also looked at the parable of the unjust steward in Luke 16. So today, I wanted to go over to Matthew chapter 10 to start us off, because it's really a parallel passage to that one in Luke 16. So I'm going a little out of order from what I had originally planned, but I thought, Luke 16 and Matthew 10 are so close that we'll just do them one after the other. So that's going to be the passage where Jesus says that he came not to bring peace but a sword. Then we'll see how many we can get through tonight. The next one that we'll have after that is the passage where Jesus famously says, "Let the dead bury their own dead." You remember that one? The cursed fig tree is one that I wanted to take a look at, not necessarily because the teaching itself is that strange, but Jesus in his behavior seems out of character in that passage. And so I think it's an interesting one to look at, and also to see the way, specifically in Mark's account, the way that he sets that up in conjunction with another event that's going on at the time. And then the last one, I'm not sure if we'll have time for it tonight. We'll see. I guess it depends on how much discussion we get. So I encourage you to discuss tonight so that I can stretch this thing out a bit. But if we have time, we'll get to the unforgivable sin in Mark chapter 3 this evening. So that's kind of what's on the agenda. But let's go to Matthew chapter 10 and just read together, starting in verse 34. "Do not think that I have come to bring peace on earth, or peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those of his own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." All right, so this raises some interesting questions. Specifically the beginning of that passage when Jesus talks about not bringing peace but a sword. How do you reconcile that with other passages where Jesus is obviously named as the Prince of Peace, like Isaiah prophesied that he would be? Also, we looked on Sunday at the passage where blessed are the peacemakers. Well, I thought we were supposed to be peacemakers, but Jesus is now saying that he didn't come to bring peace. So how do you reconcile these two different things? Before we even jump into it, like I said, this is a parallel passage with the passage that we looked at in Luke last week. You can probably see, one, they use different language, but they're very similar. And I think before we even unpack the differences in, what Jesus means by not bringing peace, but also blessed are the peacemakers, I just want to talk a little bit about the differences in the parallel accounts in our Gospels, because that can be a hang-up sometimes too, right? Oftentimes you'll find a passage and then you go and you look at another Gospel and you see the parallel account, and it's almost like they're contradictory, or they're talking about the same event but so differently, it's hard to reconcile. And I've heard an explanation of that you've probably heard before too, which sometimes works, which is like the old illustration of like a bunch of blindfolded people are directed up to an elephant, and the guy in the front grabs the trunk and he's like, I got a snake, and then somebody's like on a leg and it's like a tree, and somebody's in the back and they've got a rope, I think that's true in some cases where the gospel writers, their perspectives are different enough that the accounts vary enough, and that's what's going on. I think that's definitely what's going on in some of the cases. Another thing, though, that I don't hear taught as much, but I think is a big part of this, is the fact that Jesus, we shouldn't forget the fact that Jesus is an itinerant rabbi. So it's not like he taught something one time, the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, and people are like, I don't know, maybe they got confused about the geography. I don't think so. I think he taught the same sermon multiple times and in different contexts. So when you think of it that way, the fact that, he's going around like, I'll never forget when Catherine and I were in early marriage, there was this preacher that I liked to listen to, and he was going out to New Mexico to like guest preach at this church. And I had heard him, he was from Dallas. I was like, we're driving out to New Mexico. We're going to listen to him preach. And he preached the exact same sermon that I had heard from him the last time that I had heard him in Dallas or whatever. And I was so disappointed because we drove a long way. But it's like, of course he did. Of course he did. I believe that Jesus, when he was going from town to town, he taught a lot of the same things. And so the account that you get in Luke or Mark or Matthew, sometimes it's the same moment in time that the writer is describing, and maybe that's where the elephant metaphor comes into play. And then I think there are other times, though, where it was a completely different time or instance, and Jesus just happens to be teaching the same thing, and so there's going to be differences. It was a different time that he taught the same principles, but maybe slightly differently. Does that make sense? Hopefully that helps a little bit. Yes?
I explained one time that if you take a red letter edition and you read everything that Jesus said in the red letter editions of all four Gospels, it'll take you a couple, 3 hours. And yet he taught for 2.5 years.
Yeah.
So it's impossible that he did not say the same thing on other occasions, I think.
Yeah, and one of the New Testament letters closes by saying, all the teachings wouldn't fit. I don't remember where, is that John? Okay, yeah, so, that just tells you, I think that's hyperbolic as well, but still, it's like telling us there's just so much out there in what Jesus said and did, but it's been distilled enough for us that we can have a relationship with him and understand and really know who he is. So sorry, that's a big aside, but I thought that might be something just worth wrestling with on its own. But when we're thinking about Jesus and bringing peace, he's actually quoting, or there's a passage in Micah chapter 7 that if it's not a direct quote, it's a very close passage. Micah chapter 7, it'll help if you turn over there and read it with me. I know you probably don't turn to Micah every day, but I'll give you an extra minute. It's right next to Jonah. We studied Jonah not too long ago, so maybe it makes it easier to find. But Micah chapter 7, and I'll just set this up. The context of this passage is that there's a division happening in Israel because of the unfaithfulness of people towards God. And so in this passage, it's interesting because it's not the same circumstance, but Jesus, if he's not quoting from this passage, it sure is close. I'll start in verse 5. Put no trust in a neighbor, have no confidence in a friend. Guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your arms. And here's the verse that really parallels. For the son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother. The daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies are the men of his own house. But as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. So when Micah describes a household turning against itself, it's because people have abandoned God's justice and his righteousness. And then Jesus is applying this idea to his own coming because he knew that his message was going to force people to take sides. And we talked about this last week. In doing so, there's a natural tension that's created. And it's just a natural byproduct of taking a stand and teaching what is true and what is right. Because you don't leave room for ambiguity. Our culture loves to have everybody gets their own valid truth, but that's not the way of Jesus. Another passage that helps, I think, a little bit is in Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 14, it says, "They have healed the wound of my people, saying, 'Peace, peace,' when there is no peace." So that's a passage that's talking about the false prophets at the time who they wanted a false peace. They were peace fakers, right? They were the people who just wanted everything to seem like it was okay when under the surface there were real problems in Israel. And that was condemned by the true prophets like Jeremiah. So the peace that we are called to bring is one that is not a peace just to be peaceable with other people. It's peace with God. It's reconciliation with him first and foremost. And when we are reconciled to God, when we have peace, spiritual peace through God and through Jesus Christ, then there are going to be times when people reject that. And that's sort of the sword. That's the part of it. When we speak truth and we communicate the peace of God, some people are going to reject that. And that's naturally what divides and what can turn even family members against each other. So I think we covered this pretty well last week, but I feel like this just was a good passage to go ahead and pair together with the one from Luke. That's all I really wanted to cover on it since we went into so much detail last week. Does anybody have any comment before we move on to the next one? Yes, PJ?
I think when you look at family against each other, that's true now with the different beliefs that family members have just within the church, which is unfortunate because there's these different beliefs in these different congregations, and like ultra conservative, super liberal, and you get families who they follow God, they have the same core beliefs, but then these outsiders decide to clash and make people go against each other, and it's kind of it makes I think you know what I'm trying to say.
Satan's always trying to divide us, especially in the family of Christ. Satan loves nothing more than to turn us against each other, especially on petty disagreements. And that is by no means the sword that Jesus is talking about that causes division, right? Like that righteous truth bringing. But I have experienced personally times where And maybe I've been guilty of it myself, but I've seen people in the church who are combative or just kind of spoiling for a fight when they're not acting with the love of Christ. You know, they just want to win an argument because they're puffed up with knowledge. And that is by no means the Spirit of Christ. I mean, the fruits of the Spirit completely go against that kind of mindset, right? And we all need to be filled with love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, self-control, and always be looking for ways to find unity, but unity in truth, not unity in diversity. So it's tricky, I get that, but I think that if we're seeking Christ with loving hearts toward each other, we can find truth. And but Jesus warns us not everybody is going to love us. In John 15, he says, if the world hates you, it's because it hated me first, you know. And if you were of the world would love you as its own. But you're not of the world. And he chose us out of the world. So we need to be just walking along the steps of the rabbi. All right, let's move on. Let's go to Matthew chapter 8. And let's talk about this passage where Jesus talks about letting the dead bury their own dead. And I think I want to read starting in verse 18. So let me get there. It's always embarrassing when you're teaching and you're one of the slowest to get to the passage that you're going to read. Okay, Matthew 18:18. Now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. I'm in the wrong place. I'm sorry. Okay, Matthew 8. I was in Matthew 9, I think. Nope, that was right. Okay. Now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side, and a scribe came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Another of the disciples said to him, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." And Jesus said to him, "Follow me, and leave the dead to bury their own dead." And there's another parallel account in Luke chapter 9. Okay, so what are some of the hang-ups that you might see on the surface of reading that passage? Before we get into, what we think Jesus is teaching, how do you think this might hang someone up who's not familiar with his teaching here?
Doesn't sound like it gives time for them to grieve their loss.
Yeah, he sounds kind of callous. It's like, man, Jesus, that's pretty harsh, right? And guy just lost his dad. Not even going to let him bury him? Any other?
Well, I think it appears contradictory of the compassion he shows when he stops to heal someone.
Yeah.
And then this just sounds harsh.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things that I think speak to and answer sort of the direction that you guys are talking about. Obviously Jesus knew the passage in Exodus where, in the old law, we were commanded to honor your father and mother, and one of the greatest ways that you did that was to give them a proper burial. But in Jewish burial tradition, there's a few things that I think just as far as like some historical background can help fill in some of this for us. So if your father had just passed away, there was a period of intense mourning that went on for about a week that is called Shiva, and the family would stay home during that time. It was like a period of just full-on grief. And then there's another period of time that lasted for the month after, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the word. It's another Jewish word that I'll let you read it off my notes if you want to see it later. but it's basically when specifically the sons would refrain from their normal work activities for that month as a form of grief. So why do I tell you all that? Well, I say all that to say, if the man's father had really just died, it's almost impossible that he's going to be out in public talking or listening to Jesus. So the likelihood here is that this man is either waiting for his father to die, like his father might be approaching death, and he's saying that he just wants to kind of wait it out. Or there's also a possibility, some writers have put in, that this man is actually waiting for a secondary burial tradition. So that one, and I'm no historian on this is all secondhand, so take it for what it's worth. But what I've read is that there was a first burial that occurred within a day of someone passing away, but then there would be a second transfer of bones from a tomb into an ossuary about a year after that. And I know that there's a lot of tombs in the area of Jerusalem that get used and reused, and so that made sense to me that they would have had this practice. But some scholars speculate that what this man is referring to is that second burial, and he's just waiting to transfer the bones into the ossuary. I don't know. The whole point of the passage here, I think, is that there's an urgency to the kingdom that Jesus is trying to communicate. And there's also, in my view, a way of looking at this in that when Jesus says, let the dead bury their own dead, I think what he's referring to is those who are spiritually dead. There are people who are around who, they're walking around, but spiritually they're not a living person. And it's our job as kingdom people to try to bring them into the kingdom of life. But I think he's also possibly saying to this man, there are people who are not following me and they can take care of it, but time is short. This gets back into the conversation that we had last week, when we were talking about the unprofitable or the unfaithful servant, right? The unjust steward, who part of what I think Jesus was teaching in that passage was time is limited. I mean, you can't do everything that you probably aspire to do. So you got to get after it. And if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, we can't have an attitude that we're going to do it tomorrow. He wants us to be ready to go right now. The idea of whoever sets his work, sets himself to the plow and looks back is not worthy. I think that's what Jesus is communicating here. He wants us to be radical disciples. So what does that look like for us? I think for me, and maybe for you, it's things that I can get too busy with and overcrowded with. And I'm thinking I'll put off X, Y, or Z, which would be a better thing to do till tomorrow because I'm crowded up with the urgent instead of the important, And there's nothing more important than the things I can do in the kingdom today. Any thoughts or comments on that? Anything you guys would like to add? Yes?
The one thing that gets me on that, there's a program put out by Focus on the Family called That the World May Know.
Yeah.
And one of the lessons he had was on being a disciple of Christ. And he went into the definition of the word and all of that. And I found it very interesting that, to his understanding, at that time, a disciple was a radical follower.
Yeah.
Someone that was there 24/7. This is all I do is follow you. Yeah. And all I want to do is learn from you. And so, if you were claiming or saying, I want to be a disciple under those standards, under those conditions, then it would require a lot more. I don't know that I can, under those definitions that I can say, I am a disciple of Christ, because I do other things.
Yeah.
You know, I am not, you could get in trouble with this thing here. You know, I am a follower of Christ, but not to the degree that that's all I do.
Yeah. I think Ray Vanderlaan, right? And yeah, he talks about, I think he used the word Talmudim was what they talked about. And that idea of being a Talmudim who's like, I think he used that to explain when James and John just leave the boat, you know, because Jesus calls them. And for us, it's like, what are you doing? You're fishing and you just leave the boat? But he explained that in their time, when a esteemed rabbi would allow you to be one of his Talmudim, you go. You don't ask questions. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. And it's so easy for us to take for granted the fact that the great rabbi is also calling us to be his Talmudim and to be walking in, I think he uses the illustration, walking in the dust of his feet. And we need to be covered in his dust. I might be getting my teacher's cross now. That might be something Marty, I forget Marty's last name. Marty Solomon, thank you. I might be crossing my wires there. But anyway, very good teachers on that stuff. And I think what the challenge there, like so many of Jesus' teachings, if I'm really honest with myself, they humble me, you know? But I think that's healthy. I think it's healthy that when I read the teachings of Jesus, I'm faced with the harsh reality that I'm never going to be good enough alone on my own steam. And I think that humility reminds me that his grace is sufficient, and praise God. So there's that other side to it too. It doesn't excuse us from doing what we can and always trying to follow him more closely, but at the same time, I praise God that it's not up to me. So.
The parallel account on this is in Luke 9.
Yep.
Is that where you were? Is that where we are?
No. I didn't read that one.
Yeah, but it follows, let the dead bury their own dead, but you go proclaim the kingdom of God. Still another said, I'll follow you, Lord.
First, let me go back and say goodbye to my family, which we read that and we're like, well, of course.
Yeah.
Go say bye to your family and then come back and join us. I mean, that is, the way we read that is not unreasonable.
Yeah.
That's a very reasonable request. And Jesus says, no one who puts a hand to the plow looks back is fit for the service of the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's just like what you mentioned, James and John dropped everything. And they didn't go say bye to their dad even. Maybe they waited and maybe he saw. Maybe Zebedee saw where they were going and rejoicing. But I believe in their culture, they would have been thrilled that a rabbi picked them up, because that was the highest honor that they could have, that they would be a disciple of a rabbi. Because there weren't, how many rabbis were around?
Yeah.
Maybe, I think I've heard maybe a dozen, maybe 10, 12, and Jesus is one of those. Out of all the thousands of Jews that were living there, to be one of those that would be called to follow a rabbi was a huge honor.
Yeah.
And you didn't question it. If you were called, the answer is yes. You don't go do anything else. And I think that's something in our culture we don't really pick up on that.
I agree. I think it's without that historical context, it's hard to understand and appreciate how people would have such an urgent reaction, or could. It also kind of contrasts so much of what Jesus, his life, we talk about types and shadows in the Old Testament. And in some of those types and shadows, it's like somebody is a forerunner of Christ and they give us a little glimmer of what Jesus is going to be like. And other times, their example stands in contrast to who Jesus ends up being. And Elijah, when he calls Elisha to follow him, Elisha, interestingly enough, asks permission to go home and kiss his father and mother and say goodbye. Similar to that account you just read in Luke 9. And in that instance, Elijah says, yeah, like, go back, like, no big deal. So it's an interesting contrast, because when the highest of, high rabbis, the ultimate prophet, priest, and king comes, he doesn't have that kind of patience. He wants urgency. So let the dead bury their own dead.
You can parallel that with, not only is it urgent, but it's daily. Take it across daily.
Daily.
It's persistent.
Yeah.
Urgent and persistent. Both of those are very high callings.
Yes, that's right. And again, feeling humbled by that. Yeah, very good. Thank you all. Yes?
Thinking about the
See, I wonder if his response, if Jesus' response has anything to do with the nearing, the urgency he feels.
The urgency, I'm sorry.
The urgency he feels for the nearing of his demise.
Yeah.
On the cross, and then I just wonder if it's more about what he's feeling and just a state of urgency within him.
You didn't know you were doing this, but that was the perfect segue to the next one. Thank you. Let's do that. Let's go to Mark 11. Okay, so the idea that Jesus, part of his desire for urgency, might have had to do with the fact that his death was approaching and time was drawing near. And man, that just pairs perfectly with this next one in Mark. So, like I said, this one's kind of interesting because in Mark 11, starting in verse 12, Jesus acts kind of funny here. It seems kind of out of character. So let's just read it. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry, and seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. And he came to it, and he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. I guess Jesus was just a little hangry that day, right? I don't think that's it. Notice how Mark is going to, in the way that he explains what happened here, and I think it happened this way, so I don't know why I just said that, but Mark often will sandwich things, like he'll put the top layer, so this is like the first bread, and then we're about to get some meat, and then we're going to get the bread on the bottom. So let's go to the next part. It seems unrelated, but it's not. Verse 15, and they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers." All right, verse 18. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. And as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And I'm actually going to stop right there. There's more we're going to read in verses 21 through 23, but I want to stop right there. Notice there's the fig tree. Then they go into the temple, and Jesus ain't happy, right? Cleanses the temple. And now they come back out, and what's happened to the fig tree? It's withered. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, I think Jesus is giving an object lesson in his interaction with the fig tree. So the fig tree is often used as a illustration in Scripture for the faithfulness of Israel, or it's used as an illustration for the faithfulness of Israel. There's passages in Jeremiah 8. We're not going to go to all these, but if you're interested in looking at them later, you can look at Jeremiah 8 or Hosea 9 or Micah 7. And a fig tree is used in all of those places to talk about the unfruitfulness of Israel and its lack of obedience to God. And so here Jesus walks up to this fig tree covered in leaves, and I think it's a connection to the unfaithfulness of Israel. And you see that because Jesus goes into the temple, and who is he going after? He's going after the money changers, right? But then in that next part, what was it, verse 18? Who is threatened by it? Yeah, the chief priests and the scribes. So it's like Jesus is saying, it's condemning of them that this is the place where God's presence should dwell. This is the place where all of the things that are good about God and demonstrating his faithfulness to Israel, this should be the place where you see that carried out. And yet it's been turned into a den of robbers. The temple was a place, and the Holy of Holies was a place that was decorated with a lot of garden-type imagery and, in the holy places. And so even the idea of a tree is something that, it's like God's creation in bloom. It should be what we're seeing here. And instead we're just seeing something that looks healthy on the outside, but really it's not giving anything. It's not yielding anything good. Do you see that? Yes, Kyle.
I think you're dead on. And in another gospel, you see the disciples praise the beauty of the temple, right? From afar, they admire how the temple is adorned. And you see the same thing happening with the fig tree. What do you want when you see a fig tree full of leaves? You want to have the fruit. It doesn't matter if it's in season or not. That desire is real. And they come up to the temple, and what do you expect to see at the beautiful temple where, like you're saying, you're supposed to find the richest fruit? And it's a den of, you've turned the beautiful thing into a den of robbers.
Yeah.
And a place that it's just a marketplace. And no wonder he casts everybody out, right? Because what you expect to find in the temple is the reverse. And just like when you walk up to the fig tree, you expect to have figs, and it's disappointing, right? It's pointing to that the shriveling of the integrity of the temple.
Yeah. It's interesting because now I'm going to get in trouble because I'm just speaking out of turn, but I know there's a passage during the exile where explicitly it says that the Spirit of God had left the temple. And I believe what's happening right here is the Spirit of God has returned to the temple in Jesus Christ. And what does he find? He finds a lot of disappointing things. So it's a tree that looks healthy, but there isn't any good coming of it.
And real quick, how do
Yeah.
you relate that to us, right? Do
Yep.
we care so much about our outward appearance that we don't care about what is actually being produced? And that's hard, convicting, like you're saying, message.
Yeah.
It's like, I care more about the outward things that show that I have more moral integrity rather than the actual substance of what that means.
Yeah, it's easy for us to, and I think this is especially a pitfall for church-going folk, you know, because you're doing the things that, you know, you're supposed to be doing. You know, you're checking your list. You're doing the right, and it's sometimes it can be tempting to think. I always think of Eric Dodd. He's always saying, you know, feels like I'm a pretty good draft pick. You know, I love it that. I think that's just a great way of putting it. It's like sometimes if you're not careful, you can start feeling like a pretty good draft pick. And again, it's just a matter of, with an honest heart, looking at the Savior and what He's saying, and there's a humility that should be built into that when we really self-examine with what our Redeemer has said. And yet, I want to be a tree that produces fruit. Don't you? I mean, and it's not easy, and there are some days where I feel like if there was any fruit, it might have fallen off. But man, we just got to keep persistently trying. And I don't want to be the one that Jesus comes back and finds disappointing. Are we bearing fruit, or are we just showing leaves? I'm in the awkward in-between because I told you guys, depended on you. So now I had the bell. Are there any other thoughts?
I still have a problem with that though, because it says it's not the season for figs.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of trees that have leaves, but it's not the season for them to bear fruit. And that's what I can't understand about this.
Yeah, I had some notes on that, and this is my trouble when I go off my notes, because I need to go back and see what I wrote down there. It's not coming straight to mind. Let me find it.
Was he looking for something that he knew was not the season? But, I mean, it was not the time for it to have figs.
Well, I'm not finding what I thought I had written down, but I do know that one writer was saying that a tree would at least show buds to indicate that it was going to bear fruit. So even if it wasn't the season for the fruit to be ripe or ready to eat, you would at least know if it was going to produce fruit. So that was his speculation on it. I had a quote, and I don't know where it went.
That's also part of Mark's way of saying it's not about the tree. The object, but it has nothing to do with the tree.
Yeah.
That's not the message.
I need more. I bet everybody else in here got it, and I didn't.
Well, I'm probably not being real clear. If it's not the season for figs,
Yeah.
then the reason for cursing the tree has nothing really to do with the tree. He's demonstrating
I see.
something that's really about what happens when he goes into the temple.
Yeah.
And so that's the way that
Yeah.
I read it, is it's saying,
That would make more sense, yeah.
don't think it's the tree.
No, that's great. You could, yeah. Sorry, I cut you off.
Don't think it.
Yeah, that's great, because it's like, why would Jesus be mad at a tree that wouldn't bear fruit right now anyway? And then they come out and, we've talked about that with the dogs, and now all y'all know who I'm talking about. But we were talking about it with the high school Bible Bowl team, and one of the questions that came up is, why is Jesus intentionally hard to understand? Why does he do that? And I think at least my explanation of that is, if you were truly following Jesus faithfully, even when you didn't know what he was talking about, which happens a lot for the disciples, but then later on, after the resurrection, you look back and you're like, that's what he meant. I see it now. I had to hang in there, and I had to follow him even when I didn't really know, and now I get it. How faith-building would that be? How much more likely would you be to just keep following from there on after? And I think we have opportunities to think that way too. Because I don't know about you, but there's plenty of times that I pick this thing up and I'll read for a little bit and I'll be like, I don't know what that means. And there have been plenty of times too, though, through the years where somebody will get up here and say something, and I'm like, that's it. And that's so faith-building when you go through the journey. I think that's part of what Jesus meant when he said, seek and you will find. But he didn't say, right away. And I think that journey, that constantly picking up our cross and following him, faithfully believing that the Master will lead us where we need to go, maybe that was one of those moments for them. They, at the time, didn't get why he's picking on a fig tree that wouldn't fruit right now anyway. And then, lo and behold, they walk out of the city and they get it.
You know, you talk about ham sandwiches, different layers of the story in there. The fact that he brings it up that they see it the next day and it's withered.
Yeah, it's miraculous, yeah.
You know, they didn't know at that point. They just knew that he was upset with it. And of course, because of the tempest upset there. And then the next day, they see the result of that.
Yeah. Interestingly, it's the only miracle Jesus ever performed that brought death and not healing or life. But for an illustration.
We need to not be so hard on ourselves sometimes when we don't understand.
Yeah.
Because several times the disciples just kept their mouth shut. They didn't understand, they were confused, and they were afraid to admit they didn't understand.
Yeah.
Sometimes Jesus recognized it, sometimes they didn't. It's like, I don't want us to be so hard on ourselves because we don't understand. We just need to keep searching, keep reading, keep trying. Like you said, and then with time, that may be revealed or we'll understand better. But I think a lot of times people are like, well, I don't know, and they just get up thinking that they're not smart enough, or that's not it. He was not talking to a highly educated population a lot of the time. They were ordinary people, and so we need to not be discouraged and just keep reading, keep seeking, and with time, when the time's right, I think those things are going to click for us.
Yeah.
But if they didn't understand it, and he was standing there in front of them,
Yeah, how much more do we sometimes need?
you know, granted, they didn't have this and we did.
Yeah.
That's the advantage we have.
Yeah.
But just to not be overly harsh on ourselves or others that we don't understand.
Yeah. Guys, we're past the bell. So, do we have one more? Scott, did you want to say something?
I was going to make a comment. We started watching that series, Chosen.
Yes.
And kind of going back to what Gary said earlier, you can read all the red letters in the Bible in 3.5 hours or whatever. It's condensed down based on what really took place when Jesus was walking and teaching. And in this series, they're making him human. And it's really captured, it's kind of got us mesmerized with what's going to happen next, because we're seeing it from a different perspective. When you read the story, all you get is the story, and you have to make your own inference as to what may have happened, you know, that added to the story. This is somebody's perspective on what could have taken place, and it's leading from one episode to another, and it's really been touching for us.
That's awesome. I thought about it. We need to watch that with the kids, but anyway, cool. Thank you. Thank you all for the good comments tonight, and thank you for staying past the bell.